This week on Overtime, we take a deep dive into Zacchaeus, the wee little man. It's a lot of fun. This is going to be incredible. Take a moment, like, subscribe. Let's get it.
Center City Church. You already know.
Welcome to Center City Overtime, a weekly podcast where we take a little more time to dive into Sunday's message. And this week we're talking about Zacchaeus.
Yes.
The wee little man.
The wee little man.
I hope you know that what we're talking about. If you don't, you're like, man, she's rude, but it's a song. And you had us sing along with you this week, which was always fun on a Sunday morning. But when we did that, I learned that people learn different versions of that song. So you sing that he climbed up in a sycamore tree
to see what he could see.
And I learned
the right way.
We're going to talk about more serious things in this. I'm not going to fight.
Song. So the amount of syllables in the way that you do it is just too many.
Yeah, but for the Lord he wanted to see, it's probably more biblically accurate because he wanted to see Jesus.
Yes, it sounds a little King Jamesy. Yeah, to me.
So we want to know, put in the comments which line you learned, unless you learned to see what he could see, because I want my side to win. And that has nothing to do with the rest of what we'll talk about, but I was just too fascinated to realize that there are two versions of this song out there.
Yeah, it's funny too. As silly as it sounds, it does speak to the diversity of our community. Mm-hmm. People have come not just from different denominations, but even different language groups. We have a lot of people who learn that song in Spanish.
True.
And a lot of people who learn that song in Creole, and their versions of it change a little bit based off of the translation and words that rhyme and things of that nature. So I think it's a fascinating nuance of our community.
Yeah, it really is. And just so we're all on the same page, in case you don't know the story of Zacchaeus, it's in Luke, am I right?
Yeah, Luke chapter 19.
Luke 19, but it's a story of this shorter man named Zacchaeus who was a tax collector who wanted to see Jesus coming by.
That's why I like the story so much.
Yeah, and he couldn't see over the crowd, which is actually something that I totally identify with. I hate when I can't see over the crowd. So he climbed a tree, and then instead of just watching Jesus pass by, spoiler alert, Jesus came up to the tree and invited himself over for dinner.
Were you a tree climber growing up?
I was a tree climber growing up. Yeah. We had a cherry tree in my backyard, and I loved to climb up in that thing.
On my Fort Lauderdale people, mango trees everywhere. So we would climb mango trees to get the mangoes.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, and they actually make for a really good climbing tree. So
cool.
Yeah. Sorry, just curious.
Yeah, that's fine. Jesus never in person showed up at a tree that I was climbing, but he was with me. There was one time there was a storm. I shouldn't have been outside, and I definitely shouldn't have been climbing a tree, but storms can pop up really fast in the summer, and suddenly it was thundering and lightning, and I do really remember Jesus being close to me when I was terrified. It takes longer to get down out of the tree than it does to get up.
Well, sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's real quick.
True. So we're in this Come and See series and talking about the story of Zacchaeus and the way that Jesus approaches him. And I love that you were so just kind of practical, almost simple, but in a profound way, that the first thing we have to realize is Jesus noticed Zacchaeus. Will you talk a little bit about what it means to notice someone?
Yeah, because as simple as that is, I do think that that's the bigger issue today. We don't notice. So again, in the story, Zacchaeus really is painted as a monster by a lot of his community. So for Jesus to notice anyone, you think he would notice the religious or the self-proclaimed righteous or those who looked and kind of talked and walked like him. Zacchaeus was the outcast, the one that people were trying not to notice. So for Jesus to notice Zacchaeus was a huge deal. It required him really to walk with his eyes up is the phrase that we use. Because I do think, again, today, we have a tendency, our attention is fought for constantly, whether it's that thing in your pocket that's constantly vibrating or that task that's swirling in the back of your head that's trying to demand as much attention as possible. Even to friends and family, it's sometimes tough to notice your neighbor. It's tough to spend time actually purposely considering somebody who lives even in close proximity, but they're not necessarily that inner circle. So I do think that Jesus paints a phenomenal picture of what it looks like to live life looking up.
How, just as people who probably aren't going to walk by in a parade, like, how do we do that? I know you can say, like, hey, we don't notice our neighbors, we're really distracted. But is there any advice that you would give us on, like, how to pay attention?
So I do think for a majority of the people watching, your struggle with technology is something that you're probably, the more I talk to people, the more I realize we're all dealing with the same thing. We're all dealing with I don't like using the word addiction, but the strong pulling of our electronic mediums, whatever that is. I do think that intentionality requires planning and execution. So when it comes to noticing your neighbors, really practically knock on your neighbor's door. Like, we're really specific in this conversation to say neighbor are people who are close in proximity. I'm not looking for my neighbor. I know exactly where they are. So whether it's a neighbor at your job because they work in the cubicle next to you, or your neighbor at school because you have the same classes with them, or your neighbor that physically just lives next door, I think the practical execution of knocking on the door or taking time to prepare a moment, I've already heard some people who have like baked cookies or have trying to figure out whether they're doing, what kind of parties they're doing to kind of invite their neighbors over. Are they going to walk door to door? Or I've heard people using the Easter egg hunts, packets that we provided as an opportunity to say, no, I want to get to know my neighbors. I think we need to spend intentional time. But I also think people need to really monitor how much time they're spending. I find that I got to be careful that every pause in my life is not filled. And that just requires really intentionally consider. And most cell phones do a really good job of giving you that data point. Like, hey, this is how much you used your phone this week. I think that
I turned that off.
Yeah, I think that should convict some people. That should really be a motivator. Like, for all our data nerds, that really, how much time are you spending? Versus how much time you're spending with the Lord, versus how much time you're spending with others. I think you'd be a little bit surprised how much that can motivate you to the right things.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I feel like some of it too is like, I know you got to kind of feel things out, and we want people to be uncomfortable. It's not always going to be comfortable to approach a neighbor. But some of it, I think we can also do ourselves favors with, like, if you live in a house, go in your front yard sometimes instead of your backyard. Or for me, I have a little balcony that's barely fits 2 people on it, but all my neighbors have little balconies too. And when the weather's nice, if I'm just out there, I'm more likely to see people walking by and say hello to them. That sometimes we get so scared of that knock on the door. But it might be that for some people, that first step is just being more available, like not hiding behind a screen, but also not hiding behind a fence or inside. I mean, The weather's terrible right now, but it's going to be pretty again.
I think there's also some mutual benefit that we lose sight of. I really do feel that life, if you're living the type of life where everything seems really dramatic and it's all about you and it's very stifling and you can't escape some of those issues, there's really a good chance that you're living insulated and separated. So getting to know your neighbors is a good opportunity for you to kind of even escape some of those things that might be haunting you, for lack of a better term. So I do think that it's mutual beneficial to get to know people, to step into community like that.
Yeah. So after Jesus notices Zacchaeus, he does something really surprising, because he says, come down, I'm going to your house to eat. And there's part of me that feels like, oh my gosh, that's so rude. Zacchaeus didn't have time to like clean and prepare for such a special guest. And yet you made the point that it's an amazing act of hospitality on Jesus's part to say, I'm going to go to where you are. And so when we're people who invite our neighbors to come and see, we go to where they are. What does that mean?
So this is a revolutionary thought in Jesus's day, and I think must lead to revolutionary thinking in our day. In 2023, the church has bought into this idea that the objective is to seclude ourselves, because at all costs, we need to protect ourselves from the warring, sinful world that we're surrounded by. We never see that biblically. in the example of Jesus, he went to Zacchaeus' house. The idea was, I'm going to invade your space with my presence. There's healing in his presence. There's miraculous, there's all kind of miracles in his presence. There's teaching in his presence. And people were clamoring for the presence of Jesus. And he's like, no, I came to seek and save those who are lost. My presence is for those who have been broken, who are living in that place of brokenness. So I think as believers, we should take the same approach. I think we're just too afraid that people's issues are going to somehow, even in this story, quickly they grumbled, and they were grumbling because Jesus how dare he eat with a notorious sinner? Instantly, they were quick to label Zacchaeus by everything that he was. And Jesus just turns it all on its head. And he's like, you can worry about the social implications. You can worry about the religious implications. My objective is to bring life change to those who are broken. I can't do that unless I spend time with the broken, and the broken are not always coming. Sometimes we have to go, and that's why this picture to me has been like, I'm trying to engage my neighbors. I'm not waiting for my neighbors to engage me. I'm trying to make sure that in a lot of the opportunities that I have for those who are close in proximity, I'm engaging in relationship, and I'm not waiting for them to figure it out, or waiting for things to change, or waiting for the ideal moment. I'm really hoping that the presence of God that I know is in me, the presence of God that I know that I carry, can bring life change, can bring miracles, can bring teaching, can bring transformation to a home. I think we need to be proactive in our approach. Yeah.
Excuse me. It is profound because it's not the way that we're wired. And even those of us who can think, if you grew up in church and you know the word like evangelism, it still a lot of times has this connotation in our heads that is inviting someone to church or waiting for someone to show up at church on a Sunday morning. And what we're talking about in Come and See, yes, absolutely. Invite people to church. We would love to see them, but it goes so far beyond that. And you kind of talked about this difference between rescue and recruit. And I think a lot of times if we've grown up hearing a message like this before, we're immediately in our heads thinking, okay, this is before Easter, we got to get more people in the door. Like, how many neighbors am I going to go talk to? And we put this pressure on ourselves to be like recruiters for the army or something. And yet that's not at all what it's about. It's about rescue. How can we shift our mentality for those people who grew up with that kind of thinking?
Rescue requires work. I was recently reminded of the boys stuck in the cave.
Oh yeah, in Thailand?
In Thailand, I think it was.
So.
And how it took weeks to figure out the strategy, and it was messy, and it cost people's energy and effort and time. They had to strategize, they had to figure it out, they had to make sure the boys were all right where they were. Mm-hmm. Like, even before they rescued, they had to send food in. They had to make sure that the boys were being fed. They had to make sure the boys were being cared for. Like, they sent medical equipment in, which is crazy to think about, that they couldn't pull them out, but they can get all this stuff in. Mm-hmm. I do think that when it comes to that picture of rescue, we got to be reminded that there are seasons where we're called to send things in to care for people where they are. Like, the transformation may not happen right away, but we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we're providing. And what I love is when Zacchaeus comes to the saving knowledge of Jesus, his response is, well, I'm going to change this, and I'm going to change this, and I'm going to change this. But Jesus didn't wait to the change to find Zacchaeus and sit at a table with him. Mm-hmm. I think for us, it just means practically, like, we need to be concerned. We need to care. We need to spend energy. We need to risk loving. And like I talk about quite often, we need to risk loving and losing. Like, there's times where this doesn't always turn out well. But it doesn't mean that we're not actively participating in the work of rescue. I've heard this story told. Hey, Zacchaeus' story with Jesus is like, imagine a big, elaborate dinner party thrown by a wealthy businessman in your city, and he rents out, he rents out a bunch of tables and chairs, and they come to his big mansion, and he invites everybody. But the guest of honor is a poor man from the neighborhood that nobody would dare walking in, and it's just obvious that this guy's living different, he's dressed different, he comes in and he's the guest of honor, and that's this picture. And I completely and totally think that's not the right picture. Mm-hmm. Jesus went to the poor man's table. Like, Jesus went to and sat in the brokenness of Zacchaeus. To your point, Zacchaeus didn't have time to prepare. What it was is what it was. And what I love about that is, who else do you think Zacchaeus invited to that table but his friends and those who were also broken? So Jesus finds himself in a community of people that were just what no one else expected, but everybody who he came to seek and to save. I think that needs to be our perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's so amazing how it's the silly things. For me, it's odd because it's like dumb things like professional wrestling, or my love of basketball, or my love of coffee, or art. And I find myself in these circles where I'm like, I have an opportunity to bring light to dark places. If the only place you exist is where everybody's light, I feel like we're losing out on the mission that God's called us to for this specific season. And it is a season, and time is running out. That's the truth of Scripture, right? Like, there is a day coming where no man would work. So we have to be committed to the sloppy work of rescue, because it's sloppy and it takes time, and it's not this magical, man, if I could just get him to that 30 seconds of an altar call. It takes time, but it's what we're called to do. With that said, to your point, I believe in the local church. So I believe so much of that transformation actually happens on Sunday mornings, happens on Wednesdays in small groups, happens because relationships are formed there and then kind of bleed out outside of that. So I'm all about the church, but I think it's time that as believers, we step into the role of saying, no, we're called to bring light and love and tell people to come and see the goodness of God.
Yeah, absolutely. The series, I know we plan things out ahead of time, but I really didn't see this coming. And yet, as we've gotten into it, it feels like this is just going to be one of those pivotal seasons for us to just be available to God in the way that he would use us. And I think we're going to look back and be like, man, that Come and See series. But I also think that about every series, because God's really cool. That said, where are we headed?
Oh, I cannot wait. So this is the big conversation of the woman at the well. And I think probably one of the more poignant conversations that Jesus has in Scripture with somebody that speaks to today's culture and climate. You see Jesus approach her with truth in love. You see transformation. Like, it's such a great story. Even the way that she attempts to derail the conversation with religious rhetoric, almost like, oh yeah, but what are your politics? And Jesus is quick to like, no, you don't understand. This is so much bigger than anything you've heard, any talking news head at this point. They're missing it. This is the idea, and I cannot wait to break this passage open. It's going to be a ton of fun.
That's awesome. Well, we would love to see you Sunday morning at 10 a.m. right here streaming on YouTube, or in person at Center City Church.